Japanese General Hideki Tojo is a cold-blooded control freak, responsible for millions of deaths.
Within a 3-week period, 300,000 are butchered. Some disemboweled, some are buried alive, some are beheaded. The lucky ones are shot.
In his pursuit of ultimate power, he fights the dirtiest war ever known.
People were vivisected alive without anesthetic. It would be the worst horror film you could ever imagine. Seriously, beyond comprehension.
This is the story of the Japanese leader responsible for the attack on Pearl Harbor, an Asian Holocaust, and the torture of POWs. Times Square, August 14th, 1945. Americans have a lot to cheer about as they celebrate VJ Day. But 7,000 miles away, a bizarre private drama is playing out in a Tokyo suburb. With his house surrounded by US forces, there to arrest him for war crimes, General Hideki Tojo, Japan's disgraced prime minister, prepares to die by his own hand. Suicide is something every samurai views as an honorable act. But his action is different.
He goes to his doctor and he asks him, where is the heart? And the doctor, with a charcoal brush, puts a cross over his heart.
Tojo, the man who waged war on the US, is a battlefield virgin. He's more accustomed to a fountain pen than a pistol.
He takes a pistol, very badly aimed, and he shoots himself. They break in when they hear the shot, and he's lying there bleeding profusely. He shoots into his stomach and not into the heart.
It's the start of a pathetic final chapter for Japan's most evil warlord. A man with a demented vision of what his country should be, who, in trying to make it a reality, takes millions to their deaths. His journey to this moment starts decades earlier, when Japan and America were allies. It's 1904. Japan is an emerging power, flexing its muscles. It thinks it's the natural leader of Asia, an empire waiting to happen. They have the smartest people, the hardest fighters, and an emperor who is a living god. One of the rising stars of the Imperial Japanese Army is a young second lieutenant, Hideki Tojo. He's exceptionally hardworking and has an unusually sharp intellect. His colleagues nickname him the Razor.
He's born into a military family. All he knows, really, are military standards. His private life, his family life, although he married and had children, it meant nothing to him. Japan was the cause. The empire and the emperor were the cause. Japan was going somewhere, and he would be its servant, but he'd need to rise in the system in order to be an effective servant.
Tojo earns a reputation as a tough, disciplined operator, putting him on track to be a general. As part of his training, he tours Europe and is especially impressed by what he sees in Germany. He dreams of a Japan that can one day be a kind of Asian Prussia. Supremely disciplined, with a proud military tradition. But instead, when Tojo returns to Japan, he watches his beloved homeland descend into chaos. A brief flirtation with Western-style democracy in the 1920s is hit hard by an economic slump that follows the Wall Street crash. The nation's political elite can't cope with the onset of the Great Depression in 1930. There is social unrest and protests on the streets. Increasingly, people start looking to the emperor and the army for leadership.
There is a feeling that the military needs to do something to save Japan. But of course, they're also rather self-serving because they want to put themselves into a position of power and push their own agenda, which is imperial expansion.
The army believes the answer lies in creating an empire. But it's split into two factions, each bitterly at odds with the other.
You have the Kodoha are known as the Imperial Way faction in English. Now, these guys, they're most interested in trying to knock off the Soviet Union, incredibly.
Japan and the Soviet Union have been great rivals for centuries over the control of Northeast Asia. And the Kodoha want to settle old scores.
The other side, the Toseiha, known as the Control Group, are primarily interested in a war in China.
They know that invading China will provide essential natural resources Japan desperately needs to build an empire. The Toseiha also favor more modern, technocratic, European-style military methods and tactics. These ideas resonate with Tojo, who has been inspired by German militarism. And a leading member of the Toseiha, Major General Tetsuan Nagata, becomes a close friend and mentor. Nagata, however, is deeply hated by the rival faction. And as tension rises between the two sides, a young Kodoha officer, Lieutenant Colonel Saburo Aizawa, decides to take matters into his own hands. The whole of Japanese society is horrified. And most of all, the emperor. To have officers in the Imperial Army, the country's most revered institution, murdering each other is unthinkable. The authorities need someone ruthlessly efficient to restore order and discipline. The obvious choice is Razor Tojo.
Tojo really comes out the woodwork. He's very much siding with the Control Party. He then basically eradicates the opposing faction.
Tojo starts his inexorable rise to power. His task is to identify those behind the assassination and to bring the conspirators to justice. His methods involve intimidation and torture.
That Emperor Hirohito is very pleased. Tojo is promoted to Major General. He's well on his way now to become a very, very serious power player. And he's got the eyes and ears of the Emperor upon him, which is very, very important.
Along with his promotion, Tojo is rewarded with command of Japan's military police, the Kempeitai, who are already notorious for their brutality.
Kempeitai in Japanese means law soldiers, so it gives you a clue immediately. They're a kind of political, legal soldier.
What began as a military police force now grows into something like Adolf Hitler's Gestapo, seeking out possible subversives right across Japan and its territories.
I would say the Kempeitai were probably the most paranoid military unit that ever existed. They basically suspected everybody. The first thing that would happen to you if you were hauled in by the Kempeitai for questioning was they would beat you very, very, very severely before they even asked you any questions.
Under Tojo, the Kempeitai become one of the most sadistic paramilitary enforcers in human history, comparable in brutality to anything the Nazis produced.
They are masters of all forms of foul and horrible torture, and were greatly feared by the ordinary Japanese people. A highly immoral organization run by extremely questionable people whose loyalty is only to the central military authorities.
Tojo uses the Kempeitai to target all who could oppose his ambitions for a Japanese empire.
They go after communists. They also take on the Social Democrats and the Christians. Any other group that basically is opposed to these very strict emperor-worshipping, empire-building megalomaniacs who are currently in charge of the government there. So you say the wrong thing, you can be hauled off by them for anti-war statements and pacifist statements.
Tojo's thought police now bend every soul in the country to their master's will. And pretty soon, civilians are policing each other with every scrap of information being fed back to Tojo.
Japan is a surveillance society. People report on each other. Dossiers are held. Tojo, one of his skills as an admin figure, is to draw up a dossier on all those who are suspect in the system, either in the army or politically. And of course, if you have information, you have power. So Tojo uses that to advance his own career.
By 1937, Tojo's power base is growing. Harking back to his experiences in Europe, he looks towards Hitler and the Nazi Party. Tojo is drawn by one key Nazi idea. The territorial expansion is justified by racial superiority.
There's a very similar kind of idea like the German Lebensraum, living space, that somehow the Japanese have a right to expand into China and to use the Chinese as cheap labor, slave labor, and also steal all the mineral resources that are there. They see the Chinese as being subhumans, the same way as the Nazis view the Slavic peoples as Untermenschen.
This belief gives the Imperial Japanese Army the right to invade China. And they start with an horrific terror campaign to show the Chinese who's boss. The world looks on in shock, while Tojo, though not directly involved, is beyond delighted. To him, it's proof of the awesome might of the Japanese army and confirmation of its racial superiority. This 6-week descent into hell becomes known as the Rape of Nanjing.
Within a 3-week period, 300,000 Chinese are butchered. Not merely killed, but killed in the most brutal way. Some disemboweled, some have petrol poured over them and set fire, some are buried alive, some are beheaded. The lucky ones are shot. And with that, bestial treatment of civilians. Serial rape of, 20,000 women. over a 3-week period, and bayoneting of the raped woman following the serial butchery. It beggars belief, beggars description, indeed.
Tojo was well informed of this and his position. We know that the actual process of murder took place over several weeks, so this is not just an initial thing of victors arriving and going crazy for a couple of days. This was an organized assault.
For Tojo, Nanjing is just what Japan should be doing, and the more of it, the better. As part of his scheme to impress the emperor, he starts banging the table for Japan to bring not just China, but the whole of Asia under its boot. His plan works. The emperor is impressed and promotes him to Minister for War. Now he's the army's man in the cabinet and the most politically influential soldier in the country.
As soon as he's in the cabinet as Minister of War, he then has a platform. Now, he was a man who was very articulate, very loudly spoken, gave strong opinions. At meetings of the cabinet, Tojo did all the talking.
With his newfound powers, Tojo means to consolidate Japan's control over the Chinese by crushing any form of resistance. Guerrilla strikes by the Chinese have proved highly successful in stopping the Imperial Japanese Army. The local general proposes a radical policy to deal with the problem, and Tojo signs it off.
The Chinese Communist Party are fighting a guerrilla warfare in which they rely on the support of the local population to provide them labor, to provide them with food, to provide them with refuge. The reaction of the Japanese authorities is to try to defeat guerrilla warfare by attacking those who support the guerrillas. You terrorize the peasantry.
Tojo calls the new policy the 3 alls. It means burn all, loot all, kill all.
The 3 alls policy involves the burning of the property of those who are suspected of supporting the Chinese forces, the seizing of their food, and the killing of them and their families. So it's a policy of terror, and there are large numbers of people who died.
The 3 alls policy supposedly killed up to 3 million people, but if you look at the total number of deaths caused by Japan and China in the Second World War, the figure could easily be between 20 and 30 million. One really has no exact way of knowing.
For Tojo, China is just the beginning. He has promised Japan a mighty empire, and he means to deliver. He argues that Japan's lack of natural resources will soon bring the country's economy to a grinding halt. To succeed, Japan must adopt large-scale imperial expansion, like the Nazis in Europe.
And the Japanese thought they wouldn't be able to feed themselves within a generation, and that their oil and rubber supplies in particular were so vital, and they couldn't provide them unless they took them from areas in Asia. If they weren't provided willingly by the local population, they'd have to be taken.
Tojo identifies the European colonial territories of Southeast Asia as the best suppliers of oil and rubber. Thanks to Hitler's dazzling successes in Europe, those territories are now extremely vulnerable.
France has been defeated. The British look as if they're going to be defeated. And the Dutch are also on the way out and reliant on the British. Those are the countries that control Southeast Asia. Southeast Asia contains all the raw materials that are needed. So, in essence, all they need to do is to reach out their hand and grab it.
There's only one big obstacle left in Tojo's way. The United States of America. He's convinced it will never accept a Japanese empire.
From the early 30s, Japan expects to have to go to war with the United States. And by 1939, Tojo is convinced that war is unavoidable.
Not everyone agrees. Opposing Tojo's lust for war is the civilian prime minister, Fumimaro Konoe, who is a peacemaker and a diplomat. But when Konoe is unable to overcome Tojo's popularity in cabinet and with the emperor, and with war looking inevitable, he chooses to resign. Tojo, the emperor's favorite minister, takes his place. He is now not just the most powerful soldier in the country, but also its most powerful politician. At last, he can make his vision a reality. Throughout 1941, Prime Minister Tojo continues pretending to seek a peaceful solution with the US. But it's all a lie. Secretly, in meticulous detail, he is rehearsing a sneak attack that he believes will cripple the US in the Pacific. To help him in the coming war, he does something that is truly horrific. He starts investigating ways of killing people more efficiently. His secret police, the Kempeitai, set up a lab to research toxins like anthrax. The project is called Unit 731.
Unit 731, it's a Japanese chemical and biological weapons institution. Its primary goal is human experimentation, so it uses a lot of Chinese people, some Allied prisoners of war later on, and Russians as well.
Unit 731 causes the excruciating deaths of some 12,000 innocent people in experiments that defy comprehension.
They held on site thousands of people, men, women, and children. People were vivisected alive without anesthetic, because the anesthetic would interfere with the final results.
Tojo's scientists carry out experiments of unimaginable cruelty, systematically investigating the extremes of human suffering.
Largely what we know today about frostbite comes from Unit 731, because they're able to experiment on humans, so freezing of limbs in various forms and seeing how frostbite spreads.
The Prime Minister is regularly updated on these experiments and ensures the unit is routinely supplied with live victims.
They're taking men, women, and children, tying them to posts outside ranges, which they're then bombing with aircraft. They're testing flamethrowers on human beings. It would be the worst horror film you could ever imagine. Seriously, beyond comprehension. They really plumbed the absolute depths of human cruelty in the name of science.
By the end of 1941, Tojo's preparations for war with the US are completed. The time has come to end the pretense of negotiations.
When the decision for war has been made, there is a sense of pride, of self-belief, this emphasis on morale, a belief that Japan is semi-divine. It cannot be defeated in conflict. So in a sense, they've become the victims of their own propaganda.
Tojo starts his assault on America as he means to continue. He attacks the naval base Pearl Harbor without warning. His first act of war is a crime.
The Japanese justification, as they put it, for Pearl Harbor was that we don't need to declare war because the war itself will be a declaration. Now, it breaks every rule, but there's a logic, a bitter, vicious logic.
In Tokyo, excitement and jubilation is at fever pitch. The success of the attack on Pearl Harbor makes Tojo a national hero. He now puts in motion the second phase of his plan. The Japanese army sweeps down the British-controlled peninsula of Malaya. At its tip is one of Japan's most sought-after prizes, Singapore. Japan has never signed the Geneva Convention, and in a field manual written by Tojo, it is clearly stated that surrender in war is a dishonorable act. Because of this, Japanese soldiers show little mercy to the Allies. Just one example is the Alexandra Hospital, when British casualties and medical staff try to surrender.
These guys may have been lying in hospital beds, previously wounded in battle, but the Japanese don't care.
These extremes of viciousness are fueled by Tojo's potent brew of Japanese nationalism and racist ideology picked up from the Nazis.
The Japanese felt enormous anger and xenophobia and enormously pent-up feelings of revenge against the Western Allies. It was a race war. They simply are killing people in very large numbers to work off some of this pent-up xenophobic rage that they have towards the West.
Again and again, as Tojo's war machine spreads across Southeast Asia, the same pattern of senseless savagery plays out. In December 1941, Japan invades the Philippines, swiftly forcing the unprepared US and Filipino forces back to the Bataan Peninsula. The battle for Bataan results in a massive US surrender. Those captured by the Japanese are forced to march to POW camps.
The idea is to march them to a railhead at a particular town and then put them onto trains, cattle trains, and then take them off to a series of POW camps. But the Japanese turn it into a death march.
The Japanese military regard their new captives with contempt, and the abuse of prisoners becomes standard.
No soldier is honourable if he surrenders. It's tied in with this samurai notion of honour. And an honourable soldier will die rather than surrender. So when prisoners were taken, the brutalising of prisoners was done deliberately. It wasn't just an offshoot, it was done deliberately.
What follows is a 60-mile forced march of 80,000 POWs, from battlefield to prison camp, that will see the deliberate murder of thousands of men. It will become known as the Bataan Death March.
They were worked to death, literally. They were not given medical treatment. And this was deliberate policy. It wasn't simply an excess of war where things can happen. This is the strongest argument against Tojo and the military regime in Japan, that they actually actively encourage brutality as a policy.
The treatment of the US and Filipino troops by the Japanese after the Battle of Bataan goes down in history as one of Tojo's most horrific acts.
So we see an awful lot of random killings happen very early on. For example, anybody who was quite tall was generally singled out and abused or killed, because the taller you are, the more Anglo-Saxon you are in the eyes of the Japanese. They deliberately deny the men water. The only water they're allowed to touch comes from filthy buffalo wallows, which is ridden with diseases. Every time they step out of line, they're either beaten or shot or bayoneted. It's just an entire process of thinning out the ranks, if you like. They kill off pretty much anybody who can't get there under his own power. Anybody who's sick, wounded, or injured in some way. It's one of the most appalling episodes in the surrender of Allied POWs.
The extent of the murder committed by the Japanese army is really quite unique and quite extraordinary. Literally every single place where they occupied, there were astonishing scenes of brutality. And not just against soldiers, you could possibly understand that, but nuns, priests, local natives who'd really done nothing at all. They would behead them, rape them, and torture them in very extraordinary ways.
The atrocities are undoubtedly condoned by Tojo. He, as much as anyone, has openly promoted the loathing of foreigners and inferior peoples. As an obsessive intelligence gatherer, he receives regular, detailed reports of all activities.
You have the Red Cross passing on information that there have been accusations of ill treatment of POWs. So Tojo is aware that these accusations are being made. He's aware that these events are taking place. Does he step in to indicate that this is unacceptable behaviour? There was no evidence to suggest that action had been taken.
As the Imperial Japanese Army surges through Asia, it takes thousands of American, British, Dutch, and Australian prisoners of war. Bloated with race hatred, Tojo's forces treat their captives worse than pack animals. Starving, torturing, and murdering at will. 140,000 Allied personnel are captured. Some 30,000 die from starvation, disease, and mistreatment. Now, at the height of his popularity, Tojo is expecting a US surrender any day. So he makes a move to seize even more political power. Already Prime Minister and Minister for the Army, he takes every significant government post for himself.
He becomes the Home Secretary, becomes Defense Minister, War Minister, Minister of Munitions. He is as powerful as any single figure could be under the Emperor.
The war has become Tojo's personal project, and it seems to be going beautifully. But that delusion is about to be shattered. Two and a half thousand miles out in the Pacific, a vital US base on the tiny atoll of Midway becomes the setting for Japan's first naval defeat in 75 years. The Battle of Midway strips Japan of its naval dominance in the Pacific. For Tojo, the man whose power rests on promising his emperor victory, it's a personal and political disaster.
His career, his future, his belief is tied to success in war. There's no room for maneuver. He can't explain away defeat. And that's Tojo's great dilemma.
Tojo is entering uncharted waters. And so he turns to that guiding principle of the Japanese army, the samurai spirit, which confronts defeat with suicide. In the name of the emperor, he tells Japan's civilian population they must fight to the death. Everyone must get ready to die, even children.
He still believes in ultimate victory, But he begins to qualify, and he says it might take longer. It might need greater effort on our part, which is why the argument we must militarize the whole society becomes so powerful. Why you train the kids at school, you give them wooden rifles to parade with, and you tell them, even as children, you need to become soldiers of the empire.
Arming kids doesn't solve Tojo's problem. US forces in the Pacific are closing in on the Japanese mainland at an alarming rate. Once again, Tojo looks to Germany and Hitler for inspiration. He isn't just going to run Japan politically. He will take personal control of the army as well, even though he has minimal battlefield experience.
In February 1944, he actually gets rid of General Sugiyama, who's head of the army, and takes on that role as well as chief of the army. So this is an extraordinary concentration of power, which bespeaks a lot of, I would say, Tojo's totalitarian abilities in the same way as a Stalin or a Putin, let's say.
The situation he faces would challenge even the most experienced soldier. US forces are cutting off Japan's newly won oil fields, and the pressure's on to seize new resources. And so he endorses a completely harebrained scheme to invade the rich and heavily defended subcontinent of India. His plan is to knock the British out of the war. Tojo's ignorance of how to fight a war is clear right from the start. The army simply doesn't have the supplies or support systems for the job.
Their logistic train involves basically marching 30,000 cattle in with them, which are very soon used up. They expected to capture the Allied supply dumps, which they don't. And then, of course, the wheels come off very quickly off their offensive.
In a series of brutal battles on the Indian border, at Kohima and Impal, Tojo's underfed and exhausted troops are shattered. Rather than let them retreat, to save his career, he demands that they fight to the bitter end.
It ends up with the Japanese just expending their armed services in basically futile attacks. Frontal attacks, which are then beaten back with huge losses. The next day they'll do exactly the same thing again in the same spot at the same time, and again and again and again. And it shows you how little they care for the lives of their men as well. The ordinary Japanese soldier is just simply a tool of the emperor. He's something to be thrown away if necessary in the defense of those ideals.
Finally, Tojo's defeated army pulls back. Broken by their commander-in-chief's demented vision and colossal incompetence. Cut off and with no supplies, they lose more than a third of their men.
The Japanese sicken very rapidly because they don't have the medical facilities we have, so they're all dying of dysentery and malaria and everything else.
After the Battle of Impal, it's estimated that 36,000 Japanese soldiers died of starvation and disease on the retreat. That's out of an army of 90,000 soldiers.
It's a pattern playing out across the Japanese campaign in Southeast Asia. Tojo's cruelty to his enemies is matched by total indifference to the suffering of his own men.
If you look at the campaigns in the South Pacific, for every Japanese soldier killed by a bullet or by a mortar or by a bomb, 10 of them died of disease and starvation. At least 10 to 1. Their armies starved to death.
Back in Tokyo, it's becoming clear that the war cannot be won. Tojo is under mounting political pressures and desperately tries to keep dissent under control. There are even growing rumors of assassination plots.
Simply, things are getting beyond his control. There's increasing carping about him from every element of the government. He's a defeated political leader. He's a defeated warlord. Certainly by 1944, time is running out.
But instead of seeking peace, Tojo decides to up the ante. As his Indian adventure crumbles, he turns his attention to the Pacific Front. And if it means sacrificing civilians as well as soldiers, so be it. In June 1944, the US fleet attacks the island of Saipan. It's the gateway to Japan's home islands, and a battle that Tojo absolutely cannot afford to lose. But Saipan does fall, and the Japanese general defending it follows Tojo's orders to fight to the death, along with most of his men. Out of a force of 31,000 Japanese troops, 24,000 are killed in battle, and 5,000 commit suicide. Only a handful are taken prisoner. In Tokyo, the loss of Saipan is kept a secret from the Japanese people, but for the high command, it triggers panic.
Nobody expected Saipan to fall so quickly. This was a huge loss of face.
The emperor even offers to abdicate. And all talk is now of negotiating a settlement with the US. But Tojo is having none of it. Far worse is in store on Saipan. And the horror to come will be almost entirely his handiwork. American forces on Saipan are astonished as wave after wave of Japanese civilians commit suicide, many by jumping off cliffs.
To a man and woman, they chose to kill themselves rather than be taken prisoner. The American troops found this extraordinary. They offered them quarter. They broadcast for days through loudspeakers that you can surrender. In their thousands on Saipan, they preferred to jump to their death rather than submit.
To the American troops, the mass suicide of Japanese civilians is incomprehensible. It is suspected that Tojo may have persuaded the emperor to order the suicides. His perverse reasoning is that if they surrender, they'll be well looked after. The only thing worse than Saipan falling is the Japanese people finding out that the US is not evil.
There was a great fear that the Americans would treat Japanese civilians well, and that could potentially cause some kind of revolutionary activity in Japan.
As many as 20,000 civilians on Saipan die by their own hands, on the direct orders of Tojo and Hirohito.
It's a tragedy, a terrible tragedy on a terrible scale. And it shows how callous and heartless the Japanese military actually was in extending these kind of policies, not just from soldiers, but to civilians.
But those needless deaths do not save the razor. The emperor finally loses patience. Prime Minister Tojo's last task in office is to broadcast the news of the fall of Saipan to a shocked and frightened nation.
His popularity was so high when the war was going well, and it's almost a complete inverse. When the war goes badly, and Saipan is the key one, it swings totally against him.
On July the 18th, 1944, Tojo resigns as Prime Minister. But even though his career may be finished, he's built a war machine that can't be switched off. And the civilian suicides on Saipan are just the beginning.
Now, although he's no longer leading Japan after July 44, his legacy, the military legacy, which he was the great spokesman for, is that you will die in the cause of the emperor and the empire. What he's left after 4 years of leadership is this notion that's become part of the culture of Japan, that the samurai end is the only way.
Tojo's legacy will be pointless banzai charges, kamikaze pilots, and the senseless slaughter of hundreds of thousands of Japanese soldiers and civilians for another terrible year. By February 1945, the US has invaded the Philippine islands of Leyte and Luzon. Forcing the Japanese out of the capital, Manila, in one of the bloodiest urban battles of the war. Now, America sets its sights on Japan's home islands. Landing troops first on Iwo Jima. And then Okinawa. The fighting is brutal, as the Japanese forces outgunned and outnumbered, cling desperately to the mentality that Tojo had so fervently enforced: no surrender. At this point, America has a terrifying new weapon, capable of bringing Japan to its senses. When Japan does not respond to a warning and a demand for unconditional surrender, the first atomic bomb is dropped on Hiroshima on August the 6th, 1945. Killing over 66,000 people. It takes a second bomb on Nagasaki before an utterly defeated Japan accepts it must surrender. In the end, both atomic bombs claim well over 100,000 lives. It's 1946. Tojo survives his botched suicide attempt and is put on trial. He's found guilty of 7 war crimes.
At the trial, Tojo does not apologize for the war, says that the war was an honorable war. It was dedicated to Japan's survival as a nation, and that although things may have happened in the war which he might now regret, which he didn't specify, he did not regret the war, he did not regret Pearl Harbor, and he believed that he'd acted honorably.
To the end, Tojo will not admit his guilt. He is hanged on December the 23rd, 1948. He dies despised by the nation he abused and by the emperor he claimed to serve. Today, he is almost entirely forgotten, an irrelevance to Japan.